He was the voice of calm in a chaotic country. While the nightly news broadcast bloodshed, protests, and assassinations, Charles Kuralt showed something else: maple syrup boiling in a Vermont sugar shack, an old man fixing shoes in Iowa, a schoolteacher dancing her way into the hearts of children in Montana. He didn't shout at cameras, didn't chase politicians down hallways. He just told stories. Quiet ones. Honest ones. Ones that made America stop, breathe, and believe, at least for 2 minutes, that there was still goodness out there. To most viewers, he was a gentle giant, soft-spoken, warm-eyed, forever traveling American backroads in one of his 6 motorhomes. On CBS's On the Road, Charles Kuralt visited every forgotten corner of the country and returned with stories that tasted like apple pie: simple, pure, comforting. He was America's front porch philosopher, the kind of figure you imagined sitting by a campfire with a thermos of coffee and a mind full of memories. But Charles Kuralt wasn't who we thought he was. There's a reason this story doesn't start at the beginning of his life, but at the end. Because only after he died did the truth begin to unravel. And when it did, it didn't just shock the people who knew him. It left the country heartbroken, confused. Some felt betrayed. Others simply nodded, as if to say, of course. No one is really that perfect that we loved him. But we never really knew him. Not the way he was known in Montana. In New York, Kuralt had a wife. A smart, polished woman by the name of Suzanne Petty Baird. They'd been married since 1962. She was a lawyer, well-regarded in her own right. Someone who believed deeply in Charles's mission and supported him through every mile traveled. She thought he was working. She thought journalism kept him on the road. She imagined him in diners and motels, collecting stories under neon signs and vast American skies. And she was only half wrong, because about 2,500 miles away, along the banks of the Big Hole River in Montana, there was another woman. Her name was Patricia Shannon. She wasn't famous. She wasn't in the spotlight. She was a community volunteer with 3 children, divorced, trying to do her best after a difficult marriage. In 1968, she met Charles Kuralt. And the rest? Well, the rest is the kind of story Charles might have told if it hadn't been his OWN. It wasn't a one-night affair. It wasn't a mistake, a forgotten postcard from the road. It was a full relationship. A second life. Over the next 29 years, Charles Kuralt paid Patricia Shannon more than $600,000. He sent her kids to college. He signed letters as Pop. He bought her land, beautiful land, in Montana, and together they built a cabin, then a life, hidden quietly from everything else. He told Petty it was just a place for fishing. A simple retreat. But every September, he was gone. And in Montana, he wasn't a journalist. He wasn't a storyteller. He was a partner, and in many ways, a father. Those children weren't his by blood, but he treated them like they were. Family dinners, holidays, handwritten letters, Christmas poems. He played both roles so well. No one saw where the truth ended and the lie began. It might have stayed that way forever if it weren't for the letter. Charles Kuralt died on July 4, 1997. One of the most patriotic voices in American media took his last breath on the country's Independence Day. A poetic end, some thought. His funeral was dignified, heartfelt. Friends and colleagues praised his kindness, his humility, the sheer volume of joy he brought into otherwise difficult lives. That was the narrative. That was the farewell speech, until Patricia Shannon showed up, holding a piece of paper dated just 16 days before Kuralt's death. It changed everything. In that letter, written by a dying man with shaking hands, was a final instruction. I'll have the lawyer visit the hospital to be sure you inherit the rest of the place in MT, if it comes to that. Just weeks before slipping into death, Charles made one last promise to the woman who had quietly shared his life for nearly 3 decades. Petty had no idea. She read the letter. She looked at the woman standing before her. And in that moment, the truth unfolded like a road trip in reverse. Every absence, every unexplained detour, every late return suddenly pointed toward a life she was never meant to find. The man who spent his entire career uncovering hidden American stories had kept the biggest one for himself. Grief has a strange way of peeling back the layers. One part mourns what was lost. Another part mourns what was never really yours. For Petty Baird, the woman Charles Kuralt had legally married and publicly stood beside for 35 years, It wasn't just sadness she felt after his death. It was disorientation. A life lived in love, in loyalty, redirected in an instant by a letter she wasn't supposed to read. Two women had been promised forever. One in plain sight, the other in the shadows. The Montana letter wasn't vague or open to interpretation. It was clear, too clear. Petty might have believed it was an innocent gesture. Kuralt had grown sentimental near the end. But that illusion shattered quickly. The more questions she asked, the more pieces fell into place. Financial records, property deeds, travel patterns that lined up too neatly with Patricia Shannon's holidays and birthdays. Petty hadn't just discovered a second address. She'd uncovered a secret loyalty, an entirely different orbit of love and commitment meticulously preserved through distance and deception. And Patricia didn't back away. She stood firm, not angry, not hostile, just factual, like someone who had lived a story too long to doubt the ending. She produced more than just a letter. There were gifts, photographs, recorded voice messages. She had a key to the cabin, postcards written in Kuralt's looping script, and additional letters dating back 2 decades. She had documentation that Charles paid for her son's entire college tuition and gifted him his first camera, encouraging a career in photojournalism. There were family Christmases in those mountains, handwritten poems in red ink, and promises etched into old greeting cards addressed from Pop. It wasn't fiction. It wasn't foggy memory. It was all right there, in paper trails and bank wires. The family Kuralt had built in Montana wasn't a footnote. It was a secret second chapter. And the cabin wasn't symbolic. It was a living, breathing monument to that double life. A handcrafted love letter hidden in the trees. The courts eventually got involved. You don't move 6 figures and multiple acres of valuable Montana property between families without drawing a line in the sand. Kuralt's death became more than just a headline. It was legal drama, a moral puzzle, and to many, a cautionary tale. In 2000, 3 years after his passing, the Montana Supreme Court ruled in Patricia Shannon's favor. The letter, informal as it might seem, was deemed an expression of intent clear enough to enforce legally. She inherited the Montana property, and alongside it, a title no court could officially give her. The other woman Charles Kuralt loved until his final breath. The judgment left Kuralt's daughters stunned. Not just over the financial blow, but the emotional rupture. Their father, whose moral compass they thought had pointed true north, had navigated a hidden world for 3 decades. The man who interviewed rodeo clowns and chicken pluckers with absolute sincerity had simultaneously managed one of the most elaborate personal secrets in the annals of American journalism. And yet, it wasn't scandalous in the usual tabloid sense. There was no criminal enterprise, no salacious affair booked in hotel rooms hour by hour. It was quieter, softer, more devastating, because Charles Kuralt hadn't just cheated. He loved, deeply, fully, in secret. Even Patricia Shannon's memoir, Charles and Me, published in 2002, carried no bitterness, no tell-all rage. It was filled with warmth, with gratitude, with poetry. She included stories of Kuralt brushing snow off the porch roof, singing lullabies to her grandchildren, teaching her how to fly fish, and reading classics by candlelight beside her. These weren't fragments of a fling. These were the bones of a life, one he couldn't risk revealing, one he couldn't bear to give up. So how did he do it? How did America's most visible storyteller live so invisibly between 2 worlds? It comes down to proximity and trust. Kuralt had the perfect cover. His job, on the road, was supposed to explain his absences, his silences, his disappearances. Who questions the man always chasing stories around the country? Who wonders where he sleeps when every town is a layover? He spent decades cultivating not just journalistic loyalty, but personal invisibility. He was the traveler. That's the role people trusted him to play. And maybe he believed that by never merging those 2 worlds, by keeping both lives separate and cared for, he was honoring each with the completeness it deserved. He wasn't careless. He wasn't reckless. He was meticulous. He planned every step, every visit, every wire transfer, every story posted from one state, while he was quietly spending time in another. It was a slow-motion balancing act. And somehow, he pulled it off, until he didn't. And yet, after the truth came out, there wasn't the public outrage you might expect today. No cancel culture. No daytime TV moral trials. Because even with the double life revealed, something complicated remained. People still liked him, still trusted his voice. They just now heard it differently. Because sometimes, the truth about a person doesn't erase who they were. For many Americans, the most unsettling part of Kuralt's story wasn't what he hid, it was how well he hid it. How effortlessly he moved between two emotional ecosystems, each believing it had his full heart. But maybe that's the part that makes this story human and not just headline-worthy. Because Charles Kuralt wasn't a villain in the shadows, nor was he a saint in the spotlight. He was a paradox, exactly the kind of person he spent his life profiling. A man whose flaws didn't cancel out his grace, whose deception didn't erase his deep capacity for connection. To understand how he lived this lie so successfully, we also have to understand the stage he performed on, America itself. When Kuralt's On the Road segments first aired in 1967, the nation was tearing at the seams. The Vietnam War was escalating into a bloodbath. The civil rights movement was being met with nightsticks and fire hoses. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated the very next year. And then Robert Kennedy. And then Kent State. The news was loud, angry, and terrifying. And then came Kuralt, soft-voiced, unhurried, looking directly into the camera like he was speaking only to you. His stories weren't heroic or harrowing. They were human. A woman who collected bottle caps. A man who built a house out of newspapers. A kindergarten graduation in the middle of nowhere. Quiet, charming slices of life. He didn't rescue America, but for 2 minutes every evening, he gave it something it had lost, its own reflection. Without the scars, that power to slow down the country and move it emotionally gave Kuralt a strange kind of cultural invisibility. He was everywhere, and yet anonymous. His name meant something, but his personal life? Most couldn't tell you a thing about it. He was the disembodied voice of nostalgia. And nostalgia doesn't ask too many questions. Even CBS didn't press him. He filed his stories. He met his deadlines. He won awards. He sent ratings up when the rest of the network was down. He wasn't a risk. He was a formula that worked. That's why his secret worked. Because he'd positioned himself not just as a journalist, but as a wholesome constant. Charles Kuralt was the dad joke in a time of firebombs, the apple pie amid acid rock, the porch swing after tragedy. And in that sacred space, suspicion simply didn't belong. Still, none of that excuses what he did. It only explains how he got away with it, and the consequences eventually arrived, just not for him. After Kuralt's death, Petty was forced to oversee the estate. She had to sign tax checks for land she didn't know existed. She had to call lawyers about properties purchased with funds she'd never seen. She tried to remain composed in public, continued to honor Charles's career and legacy. But sources close to the family say the betrayal broke something silent but permanent in her. She died just 2 years after the court decision that Kuralt's biological daughters, too, struggled to reconcile the father they knew with the second life they didn't. Publicly, they said little. But behind closed doors, friends say there was a long, cold wall of grief that never quite melted. In interviews years later, one daughter simply said, "He was complicated." That was all, but none of them lashed out. None went on television, spilled secrets, or tried to burn down his name. Even in the wake of shocking truths, those closest to him guarded his dignity. And maybe that's because they also understood what the public eventually came to realize. Kuralt didn't live a lie instead of his legacy. He lived it beside it. Double lives exist in fiction all the time: James Bond, Bruce Wayne, Superman. But in real life, the stakes aren't secret identities. They're real people, real consequences. Kuralt didn't mean to hurt anyone. That's what nearly everyone agreed on. But he ended up doing it anyway. Because every secret life, no matter how lovingly maintained, eventually comes due. What made his story so haunting wasn't its scandal, but its tenderness. He loved 2 women. He raised 2 sets of children. He wrote 2 sets of letters. He wore every hat: husband, lover, mentor, narrator, with the kind of sincerity that made you forget there was even a performance. Kuralt once said, "The everyday kindness of the back roads more than makes up for the acts of greed in the headlines." But in the end, it was his own back road that led to one of the biggest personal contradictions in broadcast history. And still people forgave him. Why? Because he had shown them a version of America they wanted to believe in. Not because it erased pain or ugliness, but because it made space for goodness, even in small places. And watching him, they didn't just believe in his sincerity, they believed in their own capacity for grace, for forgiveness. Maybe that's why the story of Charles Kuralt didn't end in scandal, but in reflection that he had told thousands of stories. But in the end, the most American story he ever told was his own. What makes a man spend 3 decades living 2 lives? Not just sneaking around with occasional guilt, but actively, lovingly tending to both gardens? For Charles Kuralt, the answer may not be simple, but it was never careless. He didn't vanish into Montana for empty escape. He built something. On paper, it looked like real estate. But in spirit, it was sanctuary, somewhere time moved slower, where love wasn't mic'd up or broadcast at 6 o'clock. It was a life filled with handwritten notes, secret birthdays, and unspoken bonds that meant as much as any CBS segment. Yet just 2,000 miles away, another woman was waiting for him to come home. There are no perfect metaphors for what Kuralt did, but perhaps he saw himself as a kind of emotional migrant, someone who could love 2 lands without feeling like he betrayed either. Of course, he was wrong, but the wrongness didn't come from malice. It came from a quiet arrogance, the belief that he could carry 2 hearts without eventually breaking one. But maybe the most haunting part is, he almost succeeded. Kuralt's on-screen image was built on curiosity, compassion, and a deep reverence for ordinary people. He never wanted the spotlight on himself. He'd turn the camera instead to a cowboy in Wyoming, or an old woman restoring a rusty carousel, letting their voices fill the silence. But behind that humility was an intensely private man, one who compartmentalized every aspect of his life. Friends said he could go weeks without revealing a single personal update. He kept his emotional cards close, speaking in detail about others, offering almost nothing of himself in return. That self-enforced distance worked on the road. It even worked in the newsroom. But in his personal life, it created a vacuum, a space where he could shapeshift, where he could warm one home by firelight, then fly across the country and do it again. Duality became second nature. It's no wonder, then, that so many of his best stories were about belonging. Farmers who built their own towns, veterans who never left their childhood blocks, teachers in one-room schoolhouses who shaped generations from the same wooden desk. He wasn't just moved by these stories, he longed for them. The stillness, the loyalty, the clarity. But instead of choosing one life to live fully, he tried to experience both through proximity. A grounded life by proxy, a stationary joy wrapped inside a nomadic profession. This contradiction, however, wasn't just personal. It bled into his work. Look closely at some of his most memorable on-the-road features, and you'll find a recurring thread: people with secrets. Quiet people. People living against expectation. A pianist who played in silence for decades. A clockmaker no one knew existed. Couples married for 70 years who never spoke of how they endured. Charles Kuralt was drawn to mystery, not confrontation. He didn't ask people to confess, he asked them to reflect. And maybe that was projection. Maybe he hoped that when the spotlight finally turned toward him, people would do the same. That spotlight came posthumously. And the public's reaction wasn't moral outrage. It was a stunned, reverent pause. Because here was a man who, for all his flaws, had gently taught a divided nation how to see itself again. He didn't politicize pain. He didn't monetize trauma. He just listened. And in the final equation, even those shocked by his private life struggled to discard the gifts he gave them. In a time before mass media burnout, before social media cynicism, Kuralt helped people feel something. When Sunday Morning aired his nature segments, 90 seconds of birdsong and snowfall, without a single word spoken, millions of viewers sat in stillness and watched. No agenda, no twist, just the ordinary, rendered breathtaking. What does that kind of sincerity earn you? Apparently, forgiveness, because even when his secret emerged, Americans remembered what he represented more than what he concealed. He was not perfect, but he had given something real. A version of America full of front porches and small-town parades, where stories mattered and strangers weren't threats. And so the narrative never became a tabloid spiral. It became a case study in contradiction. A peaceful man with divided loyalties. A reporter who told hard truths, but couldn't tell one at home. A father figure to children who didn't carry his name. A husband in 2 time zones. Was it heroic? No. Was it human? Absolutely. And that may be why Kuralt's legacy hasn't faded. In fact, it seems to grow stronger the further we drift from the country he once filmed. Today's news cycle moves too fast for maple syrup stories. There are no 2-minute ceasefires on Twitter. Very few storytellers lean into warmth anymore, but Charles Kuralt did, and maybe, in doing so, he left behind more than just a moral question. Maybe he left behind a challenge. Be curious, be kind, and be honest. Even when it hurts, it's what he couldn't quite do, but always asked of others. There's something uniquely American about the way we remember our public figures. We whistle past their flaws, dress them in nostalgia, and hang their portraits with quiet disclaimers. We know when they're imperfect, we just prefer the version of the story that lets us keep believing in something anyway. Charles Kuralt gave us that version. He packaged kindness and craftsmanship into 90-second windows. You might not remember the names of the people he interviewed, but you remember how you felt watching them. You remember the colors, the slow pans across cornfields, the aching beauty of silence, the way you laughed without knowing why, or wiped a tear over a person you'd never meet. When we discover that the man behind those stories was hiding one of his own, we don't know what to do with that contradiction. We could get angry. We should feel betrayed. But somehow, what rises first is understanding, a reluctant, mournful kind of empathy, because Kuralt didn't fall from grace. He slowly peeled himself away from it, inch by inch, driven by an affection too powerful and a cowardice too human to reconcile. And isn't that familiar? How many of us carry lives we don't talk about? Longings we never say out loud? How many of us maintain the version of ourselves that's expected while secretly living another reality that brings us peace? Kuralt just gave that part of himself a mailing address, a fireplace, a view of the Big Hole River. He didn't take mistresses in hotel bars or escape to Vegas on the weekends. He went fly fishing with children that called him Pop and strung up Christmas lights across a cabin he helped build by hand. That's what makes this story so bewildering, so painful, because we want the lines to be clear. Good or bad, honest or deceptive, hero or fraud. But Charles Kuralt took all of that and blurred it into something that feels a lot more familiar. Real life. And real life, as we know, doesn't come with clean borders. Maybe that's why his story still matters, decades later. It isn't just about what was hidden, it's about what was risked to keep it hidden, and what could have been gained or lost if he had chosen to live just one life instead of two. Would he have been happier? Would the stories have suffered? Would the solitude of Montana have changed him? Would Petty have stayed? Or did he believe, all the way to the end, that the only way to tell America's story honestly was to quietly live its contradictions himself? There's a certain grace required to live in the in-between. It takes stamina to be loved by people who don't know the full truth about you. And it takes imagination, a deep, almost childlike imagination, to believe that you can keep both sides of a secret alive without one eventually choking the other. Kuralt had that imagination. It made him a phenomenal journalist and a deeply conflicted man. Even now, all these years later, his legacy feels half-whispered, revered but not loud, celebrated with one foot still in the shadows. The industry hasn't forgotten him, but it speaks of him carefully, as if not to awaken the story beneath the newsroom carpet. Perhaps that's fitting. After all, he never wanted to be the story. He wanted to find them in the forgotten dance halls, in cow pastures and desert motels, places where no one's lighting is ever good and no one's bio ever made a front page. But it was in those quiet corners of America that Kuralt saw something sacred that most journalists were too busy or too proud to notice. And yet, in the ultimate twist, the most quietly compelling story he ever found was his own. We just didn't get to hear it until he was gone. Because Kuralt wasn't just a man stretched between two lives, he was a man stretched between two Americas. One public, polished, wrapped in network credibility. The other, rural, private, intimate. He knew better than anyone how fragile good stories are, how fast they can be snapped in half by judgment, scandal, or change. Perhaps that's why he kept Montana a secret. Maybe he didn't want to protect himself. Maybe he wanted to protect the story. That feeling of coming home to a fire already lit. That magic of being known without being famous in a way. That may be the closest thing to truth he ever kept. Even now, if you drive through Montana's Big Hole River Valley, there's still a cabin sitting off a dusty road. Trees lean into the wind the way they used to. Snow falls on the roof without a sound. The porch light doesn't always come on. But the stories never stopped echoing from that wood. Even in silence, they speak.